Hi, and welcome back to In Conversation. Well, it's all about aviation. Is it safe? Is it dangerous? What are the myths? We're going to talk to an aviation expert coming up right now. Hi, and welcome to In Conversation. And yes, aviation. Is it safe? Is it dangerous? What are the myths? What are the old wives' tales? We have actually got an aviation expert in the room with us right now, Mr. Tim Collins from Upstream Aviation. How are you, Tim?
Excellent. How are you?
Very good. Look, I will say right at the top of the show, it's really nice to talk to an aviation expert that is an aviator.
Yes, I am. I am an aviator.
Because I don't know about you, but I've seen a few on the shows that go, I'm an aviation expert, and what do you fly? Oh no, I can't fly.
No, they're journalists.
Yeah, yeah, and it always seems to be a little bit strange. Before we get into a bit of what Upstream Aviation is about and what you actually do now, maybe just a little bit about your history, because I understand you're a 17-year-old, you don't have a driver's license, and yet you're out there learning to fly aircraft.
Yeah, I always had an interest in aviation because my dad was in a company that dealt with aviation, and I always wanted to do it from when I was a kid. I started off doing a gliding course when I was in the Air Cadets.
No gliders. No, I'm told by Aviator that's just crash landing all the time because you don't have an engine.
You don't have an engine, that's right, and it was winch launch. So I think I did about 30 odd launches, and the last 3 were solo. And I fly the circuit by yourself. Yeah. And it was excellent. The teaching was excellent. It was done through the Air Force at the time. I was a cadet. And I remember going home and saying to my mum, I did 3 solo flights. And she said, yes, but you had somebody with you, didn't you? And I go, no, Mum, solo flights means that you're by yourself. And then from there, I did a private pilot's license when I was 17, and I did that at Biggin Hill. And I used to have to ride my motorcycle because I didn't have a driving license at the time. And I got my flying license before my driving license.
One thing about glider pilots, they always tell me that if you're a glider pilot first, then you go to the 3-axis aircraft or helicopters, whatever it is, that you're actually better prepared for situations that we sometimes get into in the air, crash, engine outs.
I think glider pilots have to fly very much by the seat of their pants. They really have to feel what the aircraft's doing. So they tend to look outside, they feel the aircraft, so they have a little bit more, I think, of a natural affinity. I'm not sure I ever did enough gliding to get a natural affinity, but they do. They do feel the aircraft very much and what it's doing.
So you go from getting a pilot's license or learning how to fly what traditionally we would call a 3-axis aircraft. I suppose we're in Australia and people would know Cessnas and things like that.
Absolutely.
What was it you were flying back then?
I started on a Cessna 172.
Oh, yes.
At Biggin Hill.
Yep.
And I did my private pilot's license. I was 17, and I think I did it full time. I went every day doing the ground school and the flying. Wow. And I think I completed it in 2 or 3 months. And then I got my license and obviously did some solo flying. Biggin Hill's really close to London, so it's quite an interesting area to fly because a lot of air traffic, there's a lot of radio, so it's quite busy. And then I applied for a position with a flying scholarship to a helicopter company.
Now, that has got to be a bit of a transition. You've gone from what I would call, a hand on a joystick and the other hand on the throttle maybe, to controlling, to now it's hands, feet, everything. It's like being a drummer flying a plane.
It is, and funny enough, I can't drum, but I can fly. I can fly a helicopter, and it was the most interesting thing about flying a helicopter is learning to hover, because when you very first start learning to hover, the whole of Langley Park wouldn't be big enough, right? And by the end of it, by the time you go solo, you can hover over a disc, the size of a dinner plate. So you go from being completely inaccurate and unable to do it to being really, really accurate and able to do it quite well. And you can do that in around about, if you do it full time, you can learn to do that in around about 10 hours, and that's when you can go solo.
10 hours?
Yeah,
that just doesn't sound like a long time.
I remember my first flight with my instructor, I got out and I thought, planning I'm ever going to be able to do this. This is really hard. But in fact, you improve. You know, it's a really steep learning curve, and you improve really quickly. And obviously, you go through. You know, your instructor wants to make sure that you're basically safe, right? So he, you know, starts off with the effective controls, and then you go and do your engine failures and learn to hover. And by the end of that 10 hours, you know, you're a bit untidy, but you're respectable enough to go and do a couple of circuits by yourself.
It still sounds really quick to me. What fascinates me is someone flying a Cessna 172, and it's quite a nice aircraft to fly, to go from a fixed-wing aircraft into a helicopter.
Well, in some ways, it's a really good transition, right? Because you know how to navigate, you know how to use the radio, you know how to fly, you understand spatial dimension, you understand, you know, the dimensional part of what's going, whether you're turning, whether you're going up, whether you're going down, the balance of the aircraft. So actually, the transition is probably made easier by doing a little bit of airplane flying first, and then going into the helicopter side. And in fact, when I did it, it was actually a preference that you had some airplane time before you started flying helicopters.
So your brain doesn't have to try and learn all that other stuff. It can now just concentrate on the actual dynamics of flying.
Yeah, because you've got a basic aviation skill, so you can concentrate more on the helicopter side.
It was interesting, Tim. You said it was a scholarship. How did that work? Because when was this? Back in
1980. I'm quite old. It was at the time the industry was trying to encourage pilots into the oil and gas industry. Right? They wanted helicopter pilots to fly on the North Sea, and in order to do that, there was only a certain number coming out of the military. The North Sea in those days was expanding, you know, really quickly, and they needed pilots. And so there was an industry-funded and company-funded scheme where if you could apply for a scholarship position and be accepted, you got sponsored. So it was fantastic. I had a company, really excellent, ex-military, because the course was very military in its structure. People teach me to fly, and I didn't pay anything for it. And all I had to pay for it was to guarantee to work for that company for 5 years afterwards. So you learn to fly for nothing, and then you have a guaranteed job. What could be better?
Just skipping a bit, but that's an actual challenge for a lot of pilots today. They do their training and then can't get a job. So that to me is like kind of are you really going to force me? And that's terrific.
No, it was excellent because, you know, I really was flying passengers on the North Sea with not much more than 150 flight hours on helicopters and probably 100 hours on airplanes, and I was sitting in the co-pilot seat, which in a helicopter is the left of an aircraft that seats, you know, 23, 24 passengers. We didn't always carry that many, but an aircraft that would seat that many people, flying to an oil rig on the North Sea, and I was just 19, I think.
And landing on
a heli,
Standing on something that's a lot smaller than Langley Park.
Yeah, it's very small.
For our overseas viewers, Langley Park is the park outside of our studios, which is very large.
Used to be an airport.
Yes, it did, didn't it? Used to be and I think they used to open up once in a while to have an air show here on it.
Yeah, they had the Red Bull Air Race here a few years ago.
And then something happened and they went, well, we won't do that again.
Spectacular.
Spectacular is one way of describing it. What kind of helicopter was it you were flying?
Originally it was a civilian version of the Sea King, which is actually a bit longer than a Sea King. So it was a Sikorsky S61, which is a large twin-engine, 20-odd seat helicopter.
At 19, there's going to be people looking now, and maybe people want to get into aviation, even people getting into business, they're just going, there must have been some challenges that you had to overcome to actually get into that position, or you look back and go, how did I get through that?
It's funny, isn't it? Because, you know, now people do something young, it's sort of headlines, but when I did it, it was just kind of almost normal. I had quite a couple of other friends that did it at the same age. But the biggest challenge I had was I used to have to stand up in front of my passengers and give them a safety briefing over the PA, and they always used to make wisecracks, and they said, hey, are you old enough to drive this thing? I said, well, if you want to get off, you can get off now, but it's entirely up to you. But usually they stayed. Well, they always stayed.
They always stayed.
Yeah. And the company I worked for in those days and the North Sea flying was regulated. It was extremely well structured, and I was most fortunate because the thing about flying is you learn so much by flying as a crew with somebody who's, you know, got a lot more experience, and you know, maybe a different character to you, and you know, you have your professional interaction, but obviously in the slacker times you have your personal interaction, and I was really fortunate to fly with some guys that were not just great pilots, but they were just really, really great guys to fly with.
Yeah.
So the camaraderie was massive in those days.
It sounds like the passengers were a bit of fun with you as well when you talk that way.
Well, they are a little bit, because your oil and gas passengers tend to be fairly regular. So if you fly to the same destination, you know, enough times, they kind of get to. You might not know them, but they know you.
They certainly recognise you.
And it's not like there's no flight deck door on a helicopter, so the doors aren't closed, so they can basically, you know, look through the aisle of the aircraft and see what you're doing. You know, so
while you're there making your cup of tea,
no, the rigs make that for you and give it to you in a styrofoam cup.
and it is a bit of a job, because when we fly a fixed-wing aircraft, we can trim the thing and make a cup of tea and be quite happy with things. But a helicopter, you just can't take your hands. Well, in your day, you couldn't take your hands off controls.
So an airplane, if it's trimmed, as you know, is inherently stable, right? So if you have an airplane trimmed, you can essentially take your hands or feet off, and it's not going to roll over on its back or fall out the sky or anything funny like that. You transpose that to a small helicopter, and you wouldn't take your hands off, because you will end up, you know, in a very unfortunate position very, very quickly, and probably likely to have an accident. So with a larger helicopter, the autopilots are now the same as they are in like a 737, for example. Everything is almost the same as it is in an airplane as it is in a large helicopter. But in the earlier days, the helicopter had a stabilisation system, so it didn't have an autopilot. It wouldn't hold an altitude. It wouldn't hold a heading. But what it would do is stabilise itself. So once you got it trimmed for a helicopter, you could take your hands and feet off. And of course, there's two of you anyway.
Makes it a bit easier. So here you are, a 19-year-old. You've got a 5-year contract or a 5-year job with this company. And, you know, where did your career progress from there?
Well, I obviously started off as a co-pilot, and after that, I ended up getting a captaincy on a slightly smaller, 12-seater aircraft, and that then involved moving a bit further to the south of the UK and looking at and flying to the gas rigs off the southern North Sea coast, the east coast, and that was really fascinating, because going onto a smaller aircraft in those days, it was single pilot, so you were by yourself. Right? Now, there's a lot of training to get you to a single pilot standard where you can fly passengers to oil rigs. Both the oil rig, oil and gas clients have very high standards. The company had very high standards, and obviously the regulator has very high standards. So you really kind of get quite to the top of your game quite quickly. And what happens is you start off flying with somebody, and it starts off as kind of a normal two crew, and then gradually that person withdraws and does less and less and less, and you do that on a number of flights over a number of months. I guess you're flying with a sort of a safety pilot, really, and eventually he sits there and does absolutely nothing, and you do it all by yourself. And then you get put up for a check with another pilot to make sure that he hasn't been flying with you for so long that he's become a bit familiar, right? Yeah. So then you do a line check with somebody that you haven't flown with before, and they sit there in stone cold silence, and you do everything yourself with passengers.
What was it like the first day you step on a small helicopter all by yourself, no check pilots, no safety behind you, and 12 passengers going, I hope he gets us there?
Actually, it was a night flight. It was in the dark.
Oh, just to make it more fun.
And in those days, out of the UK, we used to support, it was a vessel that was putting in some subsea for a small platform that was going in. And it was about 50 minutes north of the base that we flew from. Yeah. And you would typically fly up to this vessel. And vessels are interesting landing anyway, because of course they're not stable. So moving, you get there and they're moving. So you've got to work that out for yourself, which you do because you've had the training and the practice and everything to do it. There are techniques to do it, and if you're not happy with it, you don't land. You go home. And that's always a risk.
Does that ever happen?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
They will just go home.
They will. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And a helicopter supporting oil and gas, it's very much like an airline supporting oil and gas. It's really sophisticated. So the regulations around it, you always have to carry enough fuel to go to an alternate. So you might be 150 miles offshore, but if you can't land on the vessel because it's moving up and down too much, and it's out of limits, then you have to go back to a land destination, and obviously you have to have fuel for that because you can't land to get fuel on the vessel. So there's all those kind of things around it.
All those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Where did you go how long were you in oil and gas doing piloting?
Flying in oil and gas, probably 15, 20 years.
Wow.
I mean, I actually ended up doing a little bit less flying and a little bit more sort of, line training and management and that kind of thing. As usually happens, you end up flying a desk.
As they say.
It's a smooth transition from, a highly sophisticated aircraft to some wood in an office. That's really where you end up.
So when you had, where was your next journey and next adventure from there?
I ended up running the base that I had been flying at on the southern North Sea, and it was a busy base, right? We had probably 14 aircraft on base. We would do, on a busy summer's day, maybe 40 scheduled flights. Now, they're short distances, long flights, because a lot of the flights were multi-destination, so it was not uncommon to fly, maybe only 30 or 40 miles offshore, which is only 15 or 20 minutes, but then you might be out there for 3 hours going from platform to platform to platform, transferring people, dropping some people off that you've taken out, picking up other people that are eventually going home. So it's a bit of a bus run. Yeah. And some of those sectors and landings are probably only 2 or 3 minutes apart in terms of flight transition time. Yes. So it's quite demanding because there's a lot of configuration changes and getting the aircraft to take off, and then a very short cruise sector of a minute, yes. and then the slowdown and the landing phase. So doing that for 3 hours, you're quite tired at the end.
I was going to say, because you're not only just doing the piloting, you're then working out all your checks in there, or make sure you've got enough fuel, you've got your weights to consider. Yeah. And that must be a very...
But you plan a lot of that before you go.
Yeah.
Right? So you have a very simple piece of paper with, this is the route you're flying, and you've pre-planned to say, well, based on the normal forecast fuel consumption, I'll need fuel here, and so you plan to take fuel on that particular platform at that stage of your shuttle flight. Yeah. And in terms of looking after passengers, you always had when you're flying by yourself, you always had a crewman with you. Right, and he looked after the bags, the passengers, and he did all the load calculations. So he would get back on board the aircraft and say, right, okay, we've got 8 and 200 bags and 100 kilos of freight, and yes. he would take care of all of that.
Because it's really, really important that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, you can't fly overweight.
No, I think
payload's really important.
Yeah, when I was in the military, they used to call them load masters, and they were.
So that's really what they were actually. They were crewmen load masters. Yeah, and they were actually very talented people.
They are.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, there's people that I used to fly with 30 years ago that I'm still friends with today because they're here. Yes. And we still have that bond because we used to fly together.
So what else did you do when you eventually left that base? What's your next step in your career?
Perth.
Perth. So you come to Perth.
Came to Australia.
Wow.
Yeah. Came to Australia to run the Australian operations of a company.
Oh, okay.
And that's how I came to Perth.
Right.
And
what does
I did
that
for a few
involve
years.
when you transition from one country to another? Are there different regulations you have to get your head around?
They're all very similar.
Yes.
There are different minor interpretations on a similar thing. Yeah,
right.
but they are essentially all aviation regulations worldwide are essentially the same.
Right. Yes.
There's small variations, but they are essentially the same.
Was it a challenge coming to a foreign country then having to run the operations here, or did you find that it was virtually a mirror image?
It wasn't a problem operationally, but when you're from the UK and you come and run a very Aussie company, you have to earn your stripes, right? That's just the way life is. Yeah. But I did that and it was fine. Yeah, it was good.
When you step into those management roles, what was that like, having people, not just training them, but making sure they had the right ethics and the right ethos, I suppose the right moralities to be in that industry with you? Is that part of the continual assessment criteria? Yeah,
it is, because there are lots of different parts to flying. There's the technical skills, and there's what they call the non-technical skills. Yeah. The non-technical skills are about how you interact with the person next to you, because you are flying as a team. And it's about, you know, what a lot of it is very standardized, right? The calls are standard, the procedures are standard.
Yes.
You know exactly what's going to happen at a certain time.
Yes.
But there are obviously interactions. For example, if you see your colleague and maybe you're flying a little bit too fast or too low, or rate of descent is too high, or whatever it may be, it's up to you to say check your rate of descent. And after you've asked a person to check it a couple of times and they haven't responded, then you actually have to assume that they're incapacitated, and you have to then take over yourself.
Wow.
So there's all sorts of procedures around doing that.
Yeah.
But obviously, you're working together as a team,
Yeah.
and you may not even like that person very much. You may like them, but you may not. But the whole idea of being able to work together as a team in a flight deck is that it doesn't matter whether you like the person or not. It's not going to affect the safety outcome for the passengers.
So for an organisation like the one you're working for and being in that managerial role, having that culture and the correct culture was something you worked on quite regularly, or was it just indoctrinated into people?
It's a requirement that your non-technical skills are periodically refreshed. Right. So you have to go and attend sometimes what they call a CRM training, which is crew resource management training. There are times when you have to go, you know, some companies say it's a year, yep. Some companies say it's 2 years. The regulator will tell you if you're not doing it enough. Yes. But there are periodical refreshment. You have to go to periodical refresher training on your non-technical skills. Typically, it gets attached to a simulator session. Right. So you'll do it at the beginning of a couple of days training in the simulator. Yeah. So you do everything together. And
how is that knowledge and that what you've had to do, that practical experience, how did that help you then transition into your own consultancy business, is what you do now?
Well, having been around quite a long time and seen a lot of aviation operations, I also ended up at one point working as an aviation advisor for a company that was doing essentially what I do now for myself. And that involved traveling around the world and assessing aviation companies for resource companies, right? The resource industry is very risk averse, and it's very, they have a duty of care to put their people on an aircraft that is with a crew and with an operator that does everything correctly and is safe. They have that duty of care. Right.
So they would, if they go, and we can imagine as some of the mining sectors and resource sectors going in to some countries would be not as sophisticated as, say, some other countries.
Sure.
That must have been a challenge to actually go there and try and I presume you're trying to find them an operator that is not just safe but actually meets their stringent standards.
Yeah, and it's not just that, it's also if you can't find someone that meets their standards, then you have to show where the deficiencies are and really, are they correctable or are they not? And it's in some places they're probably not. Yeah. Because it just won't meet the right standard.
I was going to say, someone who's travelled like that in that sector, you must have come across some humorous situations.
Yes, I have. Yes,
Any you can share safely without naming?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there was. So there was one when I was due to go to a certain part of Siberia to go and assess an operator, and it was a bit of a difficult trip because the job I had was like a 2-day job, but there was one flight in of this town and one flight out of this town a week, right? So whatever happened, I was there for a week for a 2-day job, and I really wasn't very. The aircraft were old Russian aircraft.
Okay.
And I really wasn't that happy myself going on the airline that I was having to fly on to get to this very remote town, right? Yeah. And I wasn't particularly comfortable with it. So anyway, I steeled myself to do it, and I actually spoke to the client and said, look, I'm not particularly happy. And they said, look, we really need this done. You I'm afraid, are going to have to take the risk. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go and do it. Yeah. So we got on the bus at an airport in Siberia, and we're going out. It's June time, right? So it's not snowy. Right. So we're on the airport bus, and we're starting to drive past some of the planes, and I can see it's not like a modern terminal. It's quite sort of on the side of the airport for these smaller planes. Yeah. And I saw the logo on the tail of the plane, and I thought, looking from a distance, doesn't look too bad, right? but we went past that one.
Oh.
Right? And the one that we stopped at, I thought was scrap. And that's the one we got on. And it was a very uncomfortable 2 hours.
Oh,
very uncomfortable 2 hours for me. Yeah.
You must have also have assessed planes where you've just looked at them and gone, really?
Yeah.
And I think there's a story you were telling about where they would only show you one side of an aircraft.
Yes, there was one man with his company, and he was a lovely guy. He was a Russian guy, and right up in the northern part, and he was kind of quite proud of his aircraft. But I couldn't work out why he kept distracting me and only wanted me to really look at one side of the aircraft. And it wasn't until I walked around to the other side of the aircraft that I realised there was not an engine in that side of the aircraft. and it was kind of, look over here, because then you won't see what's happening.
A bit of a right rudder on takeoff, you'll be fine.
You should be fine, yeah. Mildly restricted performance, but you'll be okay. So obviously I was not able to recommend him for...
Did you find his engine, though?
Yes, I did find his engine. I asked him where his engine was, and so he put me in his car, and he took me to where his engine was, and it was in sort of it was part of a hangar, I suppose. It was sort of the lean-to on the side of a hangar, and it was sitting on the floor being repaired before it was going to go back into the aeroplane.
Sitting in the dirt.
Sitting in the dirt. Yeah, it was dirt. Yeah.
Oh goodness me.
There was no, red tags to say it wasn't serviceable. There was no green tags to say it was serviceable. There was absolutely nothing. It could have been an engine from anything. And in fact, I subsequently found that he had bought that engine, and the aircraft actually had one civil certified engine in it and one that he'd bought cheap from the military. Essentially the same engine, but completely different maintenance regime, completely different certification. They would probably do the same thing, but if anything had happened with a military engine, there would have been absolutely no ability to do any trace work.
Wow.
So we didn't recommend them.
I'm not surprised. When you work what inspired you then when you're working for a company like that and doing that work for them to actually then step out and do it for yourself? Basically say, I think I can do this now on my own. Yeah,
so there were some intermediate stages, and I was offered, through doing that work, I was offered a job by an aircraft manufacturer to go and look at some military and civil aircraft in this region, essentially managing the region.
Okay.
And that was interesting in its own right. But working for a manufacturer is always a great opportunity, because having flown products and having used products and having inspected products, to then go and work for a manufacturer to actually look at the whole process of how the product is made and how the manufacturer specs out the aircraft. Are there options? Are there not options? How do they actually do it? Was really interesting.
That would have been fascinating.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and it was. It was also dealing with military aircraft, and it was an American company. So it was. I went to some quite interesting places and found myself talking to some interesting people.
But with your knowledge of flying, when you go to a manufacturer, do you end up saying to them occasionally, "Why do you do that?"
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and you also end up saying to them, because my background was kind of oil and gas, and you fly an aircraft all the time, and you sort of learn the things that you kind of don't like about it, and so you say to them, "Look, why don't you do that? Because it might mean that the pilots like the aircraft a lot more." And they go, "Nobody ever told us that. We didn't think of it."
Really?
So that's what we do. And that's actually related to safety equipment as well, right?
Yes.
So I went to them and I said, "Look, why don't you make all this stuff standard? Don't make no options on the aircraft. This is what you're going to provide, and that's it. And that's what the customer has to buy." And that's what they did.
Wow, incredible. So when you're working in the manufacturing, you're meeting interesting characters and.
Very, yeah.
Very. When you're doing that, why do you want to get out of something? Because a lot of people are going, "That's quite romantic. That's pretty exciting stuff."
It is, but when you work for a manufacturer, ultimately they're interested in selling aircraft, and you have to make your own assessment of the market. And to be blunt, some of your paycheck depends on on being able to make some sales, and you look long term and say, well, I've sold all those. They're not going to be buying any for the next 20 years. Where's the future?
Where's the next one?
And so because I had started my whole flying career in oil and gas, I was then offered a position in Perth running aviation for an oil and gas company. So it was kind of like going back to my roots, if you like.
Yeah.
But doing it from the client side rather than the contractor and the provider side.
Right.
So that was an intermediate step, and it was then I decided, well, I think in my last working years, I think I'd like to work for myself.
And when you're working for yourself, so someone watching this now and with your company, Tim, what is it you do for your clients? Why do your clients engage an outside contractor like yourself?
It's not uncommon to see an accident that has involved, somebody, maybe a high-profile person or somebody, and you think, well, why did that accident? My love now is aviation safety, right? And you look at an accident, it might be a light aircraft, it might be a helicopter. You think, well, why was that person in that aircraft? They were on holiday, they were enjoying themselves, but did anybody actually book it, check it when they booked it? Because typically, things are booked by assistants or whatever, and they're not always done with any degree. Aviation is regulated, right? So it must be safe.
Yes.
Well, yes and no. Right, it is very regulated, but there's also layers of safety underneath that.
So it's actually fascinating, Tim. Here you are, you got an engine in a shed, a plane only got one engine on, and you're going, I think I might go into business for myself.
Actually, I didn't think of it. I didn't think of it then. There was a few steps in the middle.
Oh, was there?
Yeah, and one of them was working for an aircraft manufacturer.
Oh.
And the other one was was going back to my true roots of working in oil and gas.
The manufacturer must have been interesting for someone who'd actually flown aircraft. I can imagine you going to them, and I don't know if you did, but I can imagine you going, why are you guys doing this? Why don't you do this? It would be much better.
Well, as a pilot, you spend a lot of time in the manufacturer's products, and there are always little things that irritate you. It's a bit like your car.
Yes.
Right? Why do they do this?
Yeah.
So you do. You actually go back to a manufacturer and say, well, if you do that, it might make the pilot's life a little bit easier. It can be something really simple, like maybe the size of a gauge that's on a screen or whatever. Make it a little bit bigger because it's used so much.
Yes.
And they go, okay, well, thank you for that feedback, and it'll then be incorporated.
Oh.
So I did do some of that actually.
And I know your passion is around safety. So was it talking about these types of issues with them as well? Because sometimes different aircraft have got all different stuff on them, and you think, surely you can do better.
Yeah, there's one example that there was an accident in the UK. It was a helicopter accident in the end of 2006, and it was fatal. It was a horrible accident, and it was some guys that crashed trying to do a landing offshore at night in not the greatest weather. And of course, I know about that, right? Because I did that when I was a young man. It's a young man's game.
Yeah.
And I really hate accidents like that because I look at them and I think, it's just so unnecessary. Now, that we must be able today to be able to design something that means that that's not going to happen. So when I worked for the manufacturer, I said, I've got an idea. And they said, well, write us a white paper. So I wrote a white paper on what we could do as a manufacturer to introduce a system, because now things are much more digital, it's more easily doable than analog. Of an autopilot that can essentially get an aircraft right to an oil rig, right where the pilot has to land, and the pilot doesn't actually have to do anything. And so the engineers developed it, test pilots flew it, and it's certificated, and it's called Rig Approach, and it's offered by one of the manufacturers. And essentially, it will get a helicopter to within a couple of hundred meters of a rig, at the right height, with the heli deck in the right position, and all the captain has to do is essentially take over and land. I think it's 400 meters or 450 meters it gets it to.
Jeez.
And if the system is engaged and the pilot does not take over to land, then the system will actually fly the aircraft clear of the rig, away, climb to a safe altitude where you can start again. So it's almost, if you don't, it will take you to a safe space by itself. It's like a protection.
What a fascinating piece of
it's a great system.
That's excellent. And you're talking about that, and I'm going, so you've got them, you've got the customers, but you're working for a manufacturer. Were you also involved in having to sell their product as well?
There is, there's always an element of sales and contractual contracts, especially when people are buying multiple multiple aircraft. Yeah.
And when you say people, you mean interesting people?
Interesting people, yeah. You know, governments,
Yeah.
militaries, Commonwealth government here, I've had some dealings with, and also governments in Asia, some royalty people that want to buy VIP type aircraft. I've been in various palaces, making sure got my best clothes on to go meet some interesting people.
And all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed.
Yes.
That must have been a fascinating world. I mean, people watching me going, that sounds like just the ideal job. How exciting is that?
Well, it's exciting, and then you know, if you are involved in sales, obviously you've got to look at a longer term sales forecast, and if you can't see that, then you have to sort of think about, well, maybe, you know, is my job going to be dependent on that, and is the sales funnel strong enough to be able to, you know, keep my salary coming in?
Yes.
And once you've sold, you know, once everybody's bought a new car, you've got a period before everybody's going to buy a new car again. So
an aircraft traditionally lasts quite a long time.
They last a while, yeah. And typically a military won't, you know, re-equip for probably 20 years.
Wow.
So that will probably, you know, take me, you know, to retirement age. So I then was offered a position here in Perth with an oil and gas company to go back really to what I'd always done, which is flying oil and gas and looking at oil and gas operations from an aviation side, to actually go onto the client side and start to specify what aircraft, where we're going to fly from, and look after the whole logistics and safety of an offshore aviation operation moving a lot of people.
That's fantastic. And your experience, I just want to clarify, is just it's beyond just flying helicopters. You've actually flown the turbojets and things?
Yeah, I've got some smaller jet experience as well. I did some of that in the US. My experience is predominantly helicopter and large helicopter, not small helicopter. I haven't done that really since my training days. But really on the fixed wing side, I don't have as much time, but I have quite a fair amount of fixed wing time on turboprops and small executive type jets.
So what was the challenge coming from, you've had such a various career, you've had to morph into these different positions almost, then you morphed into working for this company now. What was it like there, and how did you then transition from there into going, it is now time for me to step into my own world?
I think I wanted to put together everything that I'd learned, you know. So I'd learned the early flying. I've done some advisory work. I've flown airplanes. I've flown helicopters. I've flown in good weather, bad weather. Some good places where it's regulated and safe. Other places where it's not quite so regulated and safe. I've worked for a manufacturer. I thought, wouldn't it be great to be able to combine all that and put all that together? And start my own business, and because my passion is aviation safety, and to be able to offer that experience to industry.
So someone watching is going, wow. To give them a bit of a snapshot, what is your business? I mean, what does it actually do for its clients? Why do they engage you?
Well, obviously it does a lot because
I'm going to say.
But essentially, I might be engaged, for example, by an oil and gas company who might want to use an aviation operator. It might not be an airline. It might be, you know, a charter operator. They might want to move their people on a charter flight, and so they might say, well, can you go and look at the operator? Can you look at the environment? Can you look at the procedures? Can you look at the maintenance? Can you look at the training? We go through all of those things, and then come up eventually and say, well, yes, you know, they're approved and they'll meet the standard. There may be some things they have to do. Maybe some recommendations, but essentially they meet the standard, and you can use them for this flight. And I've done that for you know, regular flights where you're flying normal passengers, maybe being evacuated as part of a cyclone evacuation or cyclone downman, where you might use an airplane for part of that from the nearest airport to the offshore facility to move those people. A lot of people to get off of a facility in a cyclone. Or alternatively, it might be, you know, a much higher level where you're flying somebody from government and they want to doubly check that everything's right, so that the person from the, you know, government can fly in a safe airplane.
And I suppose governments start wanting to talk to someone like yourself with that knowledge and base. You know, we're May 2019. If you're watching this in the future, that we've had the 737 thing go on, and we get told one thing. But your experience in oil and gas is if that's the standard oil and gas, the standard is like 5 times, 10 times deeper.
Yeah, it's hard to put a number on it, but the standards in oil and gas aviation are really, really high.
and I suppose my point is, so when something like the 737 incident's going on and they consult with you, your methodology and your internal thinking is a lot different. And how do you go about assessing that? What are you looking for that causes that to happen to an aircraft? And what did you find?
Well, I haven't looked in detail at the
No.
at the 737 MAX, obviously, because it's all very sort of
Yes.
hush-hush at the moment. But this kind of thing has happened in the past.
Right.
And so what you look at is you'd say, well, first of all, what is the problem? What's causing the problem? Is there a fix? It might well be software. It might be why is the indication wrong that's causing the software to make its assessment and do what it's doing in the first place. So that needs to be looked at. So typically you would take an aircraft and you would go and flight test it, and you would instrument it. So you put all sorts of sensors and instrumentation on it, and it should be then flown by test pilots with flight test engineers. Out comes the data.
Yeah.
They work out what the problem is. The software adjustments are made, or hardware adjustments, whatever they may be. And then, people talk about simulator training, but obviously the simulator is a creation of what the aircraft does, right? So you actually have to tell the simulator what the aircraft does. The simulator doesn't know, it doesn't behave like it does behave like an aircraft, but it only behaves by what you've told
What you've told it.
Right?
Yep.
So then you have to take whatever fix has been found for the issue on the aircraft, you have to code that and incorporate that into the simulator.
Yeah.
And then you have to make sure that the pilots go through the right simulator training.
Yeah.
And that specific, whatever it may be, the specific subject that might have caused the problem, you might want to make sure that, and if I was advising one of my clients, I'd say we'll make sure that the pilots have practiced that in the simulator and they've made a certain level of attainment, and it's then ticked off as being a supplementary check or a supplementary subject, whatever it may be, and then they're safe to fly with our passengers. And that's how we would assess it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just say the 737, I mean, mine's very, very broad in what I know, but basically the aircraft started to nose down. There's a computer program on it or software program that told it to start nosing down, so that's what it was doing. But obviously it must be taking that reading from something else reading, and I thought it was the angle of attack that could be.
It is, yeah. It's taking a reading from an angle of attack sensor. So really, the most interesting thing from my side is why is the angle of attack sensor giving a false reading?
And just for people, angle of attack is just that angle of the wing, and it's the angle of attack is the aerofoil going through the wind, isn't it?
It is. It's related to a lot of different things, right? It's related to.
If it's too steep, it stalls, and
if essentially a wing is too steep, then the air hitting the edge of the wing is turbulent, rolls over, and you lose lift. That's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
But you need some angle of attack because you have to make the aerofoil work to take you into the air.
Yeah, you need to lift. So and essentially the angle of attack was getting, or it was reading that it was too steep?
On the latest one, the Ethiopian one, and there is a report that's available, the initial report, but it suddenly said I'm 75 degrees nose up, which is like that. Well, obviously that's not right.
Yes.
But this the system that's designed to push the nose down, which has been known as MCAS that everybody talks about, it really is meant to be a protection, right? Because it saw the nose at 75 degrees, or what it thought was 75 degrees, and went, I can't have this, I've got to push it down.
Yes.
And then it all got rather confused because it relies on certain things to be in place or not in place to work. So if the autopilot's connected, it doesn't work. The autopilot has to be disconnected, right? And the autopilot was disconnected because the aircraft thought it was 75 degrees nose up, and so it automatically said, bing, autopilot off, I can't fly this at 75 degrees. So there's a lot of different steps within the system. The aircraft is meant to try and protect you.
Yes.
And it was essentially trying to protect them, but it was trying to protect them from something that was not actually in existence.
Wow.
So that's what can happen.
Goodness me. So your world is a very, very complex world, and especially when you're looking from a customer's perspective, and your emphasis for the customers is to protect your customers in this area. What is it the kind of things, can you give us a couple of examples of jobs you've been asked for by customers? Say, can you do this for us, or can you do that for us?
I have been asked to sign off on a helicopter operator to move some people offshore in Asia, where the aircraft didn't meet my specification because it was too old, and it was a single engine aircraft, and it wasn't equipped with the right instrumentation, etc., etc. So it wasn't really going to to pass, and I actually declined the job because I was actually asked to sign it off, and I would not do that. So I actually didn't even take the job. I didn't look at it, but I did, out of curiosity, take a look on YouTube. And I'm quite glad that I didn't take the job and sign it off, because people put all sorts of things on YouTube.
They do, don't they?
Yeah, funny enough.
Funny enough.
It's your friend when you, when you're trying to look for, aviation things.
Yeah.
It's amazing what you can see.
What did you actually see?
Oh, I saw some low flying. I saw hands not on the controls. I saw, all sorts of things.
All sorts of passengers having a go.
Yeah. Well, you yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure everyone looking at YouTube, I've seen stuff like that.
Well, just have a look, because it's there.
So, Tim, what is the future for your company? Where do you plan to take it from here?
I would obviously like to expand it. My passion is aviation safety, and what I would like to do is create my company such that we specialise in aviation safety and provide advice to governments, industry, aviators to make sure that it's being done right and with the lowest risk. And that's really what I do. That's my passion. In terms of making the business huge, well, maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah.
Safety's not really about business to me. It's about a passion and doing it right.
With that passion, and this might be a little bit off tangent, but does that passion rely on, or does it then extend to, people in the journalistic field, like ourselves, being able to come to you and say, hey, this has just happened, can you give us an opinion on things like that?
Yeah, that also happens. I mean, obviously there's a lot of opinions, but it's always good to be able to have someone with a technical background to at least be able to really understand what is happening. And if you don't have a technical background, everybody can read the paper or watch the TV and think I don't want to fly in that aircraft because it's not safe. The fact is that aircraft and civil air transport is really, really safe because it's very, very structured. And this Boeing thing will blow over. It will become a safe aircraft. And you really don't need to worry too much about it, but it's got to be done. It's got to be done right.
For a customer out there now that says, hey, that's the type of person I'd like on our team to engage them, Tim, how do they actually contact you? What is the best way of contacting you and your company?
My company is called Upstream Aviation. That can be Googled. It's actually upstream-aviation.com. And all the information to contact me is on there.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure having a chat with you. I hope we can do this again.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.